My name is Samantha. I am 34 years old, and today I hold the fate of my entire family in the palm of my hand. Exactly 7 years ago, I stood by the front door in my only cheap suit, begging my mother to let me leave for the final interview that could change my life. Instead of wishing me luck, she blocked the exit and told me my only purpose was to babysit my sister's children so she could attend a luxury brunch. My father laughed and said, "Girls like me do not get lives, we only get duties." When my sister dropped her heavy diaper bag at my feet and told me not to ruin her weekend, I made a choice that severed my family ties forever. I stepped over the bag, walked out the back door, and vanished from their lives. They thought I was a failure who would eventually come crawling back. What they did not know was that 7 years later, they would be sitting in a corporate boardroom begging a ruthless senior partner to save them from federal prison and bankruptcy, completely unaware that the executive holding the power to destroy them was the exact same daughter they threw away. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled their fraudulent empire without them even realizing it, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire to crush the people who tried to keep you at the bottom. The rain poured down on the morning of my final interview. I had spent the last day preparing for a meeting at a top mergers and acquisitions firm in New York City. I had starved myself to afford the bus ticket, living off instant noodles in sheer spite. Both of my hands were shaking as I adjusted the collar of my discount store blazer. It did not fit right, but it was the best I could do. I took a deep breath, clutching my portfolio, and walked down the hallway toward the front door. My mother, Brenda, stood right in front of the exit. Her arms were crossed over her silk morning robe, looking at me with deep annoyance. "Where do you think you are going?" she demanded. "I have my final interview today, Mom," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I told you weeks ago. This job could get me out of debt." Brenda did not move. "Your sister has brunch with the country club wives this morning," she stated. "You are watching her kids." My stomach dropped. "Mom, I cannot. If I miss this, I lose the opportunity completely. This is my only ticket out. I worked months to get here." My father, Thomas, chuckled from his leather recliner. He did not even look up from his tablet. "Girls like you do not get lives, Samantha," he said with casual cruelty. "You get duties. Ashley is married to a chief financial officer. She has an image to maintain. She cannot be seen dragging toddlers to brunch." The injustice burned my throat. While I spent 4 years working night jobs cleaning offices to pay for my finance degree, my parents drained their savings for Ashley's destination wedding. Ashley married Devin, an African-American financial executive whose flashy suits immediately won my parents over. Devin walked around our house like he owned the place, constantly bragging about his offshore investments. My parents worshipped him because he provided the affluent image they craved. They gave Ashley everything and demanded that I give her the rest. "Dad, please," I begged, feeling tears in my eyes. "I will babysit every weekend next month. I just need 4 hours today. This job pays enough for me to finally move out and stop being a burden." "You are a burden because you choose to be difficult," Brenda snapped, blocking the doorknob. "You are incredibly selfish, Samantha. Your sister is trying to build a network for her husband. Devin works extremely hard to provide for his family, and Ashley needs to support him. The least you can do is watch your own niece and nephew for a few hours." The front door swung open, pushing Brenda slightly back. Ashley walked in holding a massive designer coffee cup, completely oblivious to the tension. She looked perfectly polished, wearing a cashmere sweater and pristine white trousers. Behind her, 2 toddlers were already running toward the living room, screaming loudly. Ashley did not even look at my face. She simply dropped a heavy, overstuffed diaper bag directly onto my scuffed shoes. "Make sure the bottles are warm this time," Ashley said, examining her freshly manicured nails. "The boy needs a nap at noon and the girl needs her tablet charged. Do not ruin my weekend by calling me about stupid things. Devin is dropping off his golf clubs later, so make sure you open the garage for him." I stared down at the heavy bag resting against my feet. I looked at the rain lashing against the front window. I looked at my mother glaring at me with expectation, waiting for my usual quiet submission. I looked at my father, who was completely ignoring my existence. And finally, I looked at Ashley, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life, treating me like hired help. Every single day of my childhood had led to this exact moment. Every dismissed accomplishment, every mocked ambition, every time I was told my only value was serving a sister who despised me. They thought they had broken me down so thoroughly that I would just accept this final humiliation. They thought they owned my future. I did not argue anymore. I did not scream, and I did not cry. A sudden freezing clarity washed over my mind completely. I grabbed my portfolio tightly and stepped right over the diaper bag. I walked straight out into the cold storm, leaving them behind forever. As my foot cleared the heavy canvas diaper bag, my father finally looked up from his glowing tablet screen. His voice boomed across the entire living room, incredibly sharp. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer part of this family," he shouted. "We will cut your health insurance, and I am taking back the keys to your car. You will have absolutely nothing." I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the key ring to the beat-up sedan they held over my head for years, and dropped it onto the hallway table. The metal clattered loudly, echoing in the hallway. I did not use the front entrance. Brenda was still blocking it, fully expecting me to push past her. Instead, I pivoted sharply, marched straight through our narrow kitchen, threw open the back door, and immediately plunged headfirst into the torrential downpour. The freezing rain was absolutely merciless. It hit my cheap suit like icy needles soaking through the thin polyester fabric. I had 2 miles to run before reaching the nearest subway station. Every step felt like wading through freezing concrete. My discount store heels offered no protection against the flooded sidewalks. The cheap adhesive binding the shoes together began to dissolve. Water seeped inside, soaking my bare feet, making each stride a slippery, painful struggle. I focused entirely on the heavy leather portfolio clutched tightly to my chest. It contained my financial models, my case studies, and my only way out of this nightmare. I wrapped my arms around it, shielding it from the rain with my own shivering body. Cars sped past me, splashing water against my legs. I absolutely did not stop. My lungs burned with the frigid air and my muscles ached. By the time I reached the subway terminal, I was drenched. I swiped my transit card with numb fingers and rushed down the stairs. The underground station offered shelter, but the damage was already done. My blazer clung heavily to my shivering shoulders. Commuters stared at me with pity, shifting away from the wet footprints I left on the platform. I ignored them all. I boarded the train, gripping the metal handrail tightly to keep my shaking legs from giving out. I closed my eyes and forced my mind to compartmentalize the physical misery. I pushed away the image of Ashley lounging in her cashmere sweater. I erased the sound of my father threatening my livelihood. I channeled my burning rage into pure, calculating focus. I mentally reviewed the complex corporate valuation models I had memorized. I visualized the balance sheets and leveraged buyout structures. I turned my anger into a weapon. I emerged from the subway station and stood before the towering glass and steel skyscraper in the financial district. The headquarters of the most ruthless mergers and acquisitions firm looked intimidating. I walked through the revolving doors, leaving a trail of rainwater across the pristine marble lobby. The security guards eyed my ruined shoes and soaked clothes, but my name was on the executive visitor list. The receptionist on the 40th floor looked horrified when I stepped out of the elevator. She handed me a box of tissues, assuming I would run to the restroom to fix my appearance. I took one tissue, wiped the rainwater from my portfolio, and told her I was ready for the managing partners. I was escorted into a massive glass-walled boardroom. 3 senior executives sat at the far end of a long mahogany table. They wore bespoke, tailored suits and projected an aura of absolute corporate dominance. When they looked up and saw me standing there, the room fell silent. They expected a frantic apology. They expected me to shrink, to offer pathetic excuses about the weather, to beg for their understanding. I did not give them a single word of apology. I walked confidently to the chair opposite them, sat down with perfect posture, and placed my dry portfolio squarely on the table. "I am ready to begin," I stated, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. The lead partner, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s, raised an eyebrow. He exchanged a brief look with his colleagues. Without asking about my appearance, he slid a thick, complex financial dossier across the table. It was a brutal, leveraged buyout case study designed to overwhelm candidates. He gave me 10 minutes to read it and propose a restructuring strategy. I did not need 10 minutes. I opened the file, my eyes scanning the intricate web of debt structures, equity distributions, and cash flow projections. I saw the hidden liabilities immediately. I saw the bloated management expenses and the inefficient asset allocations. I looked up at the partners. "This target company is bleeding capital through gross mismanagement of its supply chain." I began, my tone authoritative and relentless. "You do not need to assume their existing debt. You strip the secondary assets, liquidate the underperforming regional divisions, and restructure the executive compensation packages. If you execute a hostile takeover and replace the chief financial officer, you increase the profit margin by 40% in the first 2 quarters. I systematically dismantled the entire financial structure of the company. I cited specific tax loopholes, identified redundant operational costs, and proposed a ruthless consolidation strategy that maximized shareholder value while eliminating dead weight. I spoke with the icy precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. I did not hesitate. I did not falter. I delivered the analysis with absolute, unshakable confidence. The 3 managing partners sat in stunned silence. They stared at me, completely captivated by the brilliant, aggressive strategy I had just laid out. The lead partner closed the thick financial dossier very slowly. He looked at my soaked jacket, my completely ruined shoes, and then directly into my eyes. He saw the sheer, unyielding hunger driving me. He saw someone who would ruthlessly tear through any obstacle just to win. He finally smiled, a cold, approving smile. "You are hired," the lead partner said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "We need someone exactly like you on this floor." I stood up, shook his hand with a firm, unwavering grip, and walked out of that glass-walled room. My clothes were still clinging to my skin, and my ruined shoes squelched against the polished marble floor of the corridor, but I had never felt more powerful. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, watching the floor numbers descend on the digital display. I had done it. I had secured a position at the most prestigious firm in the city, securing a salary that would finally break the chains of my debt. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped back out onto the street. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the gray city sky. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held down the power button. The screen illuminated, and my device immediately began vibrating violently in my hand. Notifications flooded the screen in a relentless, frantic wave. I stood on the crowded sidewalk and stared at the damage. There were 47 missed calls. Most were from my mother, a few from my father, and several from Ashley. They had panicked when their unpaid babysitter actually dared to choose her own future over their convenience. I opened my messages and saw a massive block of text from Brenda. It was not a message asking if I was safe. It was not an apology. "You embarrassed your sister," the text read. "Devin had to cancel his golf game to watch his own children. You are completely selfish and ungrateful. You are dead to us. Do not bother coming back for your things. We are throwing your trash on the curb." I read the words twice, letting the cold reality of hatred from my mother wash over me. They had actually done it. They had discarded me completely over a canceled brunch. I did not type a response. I did not call her back to beg or explain. I simply hit the block button on her number. Then I blocked my father. Then I blocked Ashley and Devin. I severed the digital ties with the same clinical precision I used to analyze corporate debt. I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and the portfolio in my hands. I was completely starting over from absolute zero. That night, I slept on a lumpy futon in the tiny studio apartment of my college roommate. She lent me a dry sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants. I stared at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the sirens wailing outside. I had no savings, no car, and no family. My childhood possessions were sitting in black garbage bags on a wet sidewalk in Connecticut. But as I lay there in the dark, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations was gone. They could no longer use their conditional love to manipulate me. I was entirely responsible for my own survival, and I welcomed the challenge. The very next morning, I used a high-interest payday loan to buy 3 generic business suits from a discount rack. I moved into a cheap windowless room in a shared apartment in Queens. I showed up at the firm an hour before anyone else and left long after the senior executives had gone home. My first year at the firm was an absolute gauntlet. I worked 80-hour weeks routinely. I ate dinner at my desk, highlighting balance sheets and digging through corporate tax filings. The other junior associates complained about the grueling hours and the intense pressure, but I thrived in it. I channeled every ounce of my buried rage, every memory of my father and his dismissal, and every echoing insult from my mother directly into my work. I became a machine. Financial modeling became my sanctuary. When I looked at numbers, they made perfect sense. They did not lie, they did not manipulate, and they did not play favorites. While I was meticulously building my career in the shadows, my family continued living their extravagant delusion. I saw their public social media posts through mutual connections. Ashley and Devin were constantly taking luxury vacations, posting pictures from 5-star resorts in Aspen and first-class lounges flying to Europe. The captions always praised Devin for being such a successful executive, but my trained financial eye knew better. I knew exactly what a startup chief financial officer made, and it did not cover weekly shopping sprees at luxury boutiques. My parents were funding their lavish lifestyle, draining their own retirement accounts to maintain the golden child and her image. They were buying the illusion of a perfect family. I ignored their performative happiness and focused entirely on my ascent. My cold, analytical approach to business made me indispensable to the managing partners. I never let emotion cloud my judgment. I gutted failing companies with ruthless efficiency. I negotiated mergers that intimidated executives twice my age. Every time I dismantled a corrupt corporate structure, I felt like I was tearing down the very systems of entitlement that my sister and my brother-in-law represented. The pain of my family and their betrayal hardened into an untouchable armor. I earned my first major promotion within 18 months. My salary doubled, and then my bonus tripled it. I paid off my student loans in a single transfer. I moved out of the windowless room in Queens and leased a sleek, modern apartment overlooking the skyline. I bought beautiful tailored suits. I was accumulating power, wealth, and influence at an unprecedented rate, but I kept my life completely private. I did not post photos of my promotions. I did not flaunt my new income. I operated in total silence, understanding that true power does not need an audience. I was quietly sharpening my skills every day. 3 years after my escape, my quiet dedication paid off in a massive way. I was exactly 30 years old when the managing partners called me into the glass boardroom, not to test my skills, but to offer me a seat at the table. I was officially promoted to junior partner. My compensation package shifted from a generous salary to equity shares and profit percentages. The numbers on my bank statements were staggering. I was making more money in a single quarter than my father had earned in his entire career. Yet my lifestyle remained entirely understated. I did not buy a flashy sports car or a sprawling estate. I invested my capital aggressively. I purchased a minimalist penthouse in a highly secure building, but I furnished it with clean, functional pieces. I hired a private wealth manager to funnel my earnings into diversified portfolios and anonymous holding companies. I learned very early that new money screams, but true wealth whispers. My colleagues bought luxury vehicles and wore their bonuses on their wrists. I wore bespoke, unbranded suits and drove a modest hybrid. I kept my footprint incredibly small. I wanted my bank accounts heavy and my public presence entirely invisible. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, my desire for anonymity was severely tested. I was walking through an upscale grocery store near my office, carrying a basket of imported produce, when I heard a sharp gasp. I turned around and locked eyes with my Aunt Beatrice. She was the older sister of my mother, a woman who thrived on suburban gossip and family drama. She looked at my simple gray trench coat and my completely bare face. I had just finished an exhausting financial audit and skipped makeup entirely. She gripped her shopping cart tightly and stared at me as if she had just seen a ghost. "Samantha," she whispered, taking a hesitant step backward. "We all thought you were living on the streets." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my perfectly neutral expression. I asked her what she meant by that. Beatrice leaned in, her eyes darting around the aisles as if sharing a top-secret state mystery. "Your mother and father told everyone about your terrible mental breakdown," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "They said you snapped under the pressure of trying to compete with Ashley. They told the entire extended family that you ran away, dropped completely out of society, and were living in absolute poverty somewhere in a dangerous neighborhood." I stood completely still, digesting the sheer magnitude of their deception. My parents had engineered an elaborate, highly damaging smear campaign to cover up the fact that I had escaped their control. They could not handle the social embarrassment of a daughter cutting them off, so they painted me as a mentally unstable failure. It was a brilliant, malicious tactic designed to protect their perfect image while systematically destroying mine. Beatrice patted my arm with a condescending sigh. "It is such a tragedy, Samantha. Especially when you look at how beautifully Ashley and Devin are doing. They are the ultimate success story. Devin was just featured in a local business magazine and your parents bought 50 copies. Ashley is basically a celebrity in their social circle now. They just bought a second vacation home and your parents could not be prouder. It is a shame you could not follow their excellent example. If you ever need a hot meal, you can always call me." I looked at my aunt, taking in her patronizing smile and her cheap costume jewelry. I could have crushed her entire worldview right then and there. I could have pulled out my phone and showed her the balance of my offshore investment accounts. I could have told her that my firm handled transactions worth more than the gross domestic product of small countries. I could have casually mentioned that I had dinner with actual billionaires on a weekly basis. The urge to correct the rumor was incredibly strong. I wanted to watch her jaw drop. I wanted to shatter the carefully constructed narrative of my parents and expose them as bitter, rejected liars. But my corporate training kicked in. In the world of elite finance, you never reveal your hand until the exact moment you are ready to strike. You let your competitors believe they have the upper hand. You let them grow arrogant, lazy, and careless. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the ultimate tactical advantage. I looked at Beatrice and forced a small, utterly pathetic smile onto my face. "Thank you, Aunt Beatrice," I said softly, looking down at my shoes. "I am just trying to survive day by day. Please tell my parents I am doing my best." Beatrice looked highly satisfied with my miserable performance. She gave me one last pitying look and pushed her cart down the aisle. I walked to the register, paid for my groceries using a black titanium corporate card, and stepped into my waiting private car. I leaned back against the leather seat and let out a genuine predatory laugh. They thought I was drowning at the bottom of the ocean. They genuinely believed that without their guidance and financial support, I had crumbled into a broken, worthless mess. They were using my supposed misery to elevate their own hollow achievements. I realized then that my parents, Ashley and Devin, were building a massive house of cards on a foundation of absolute lies. I decided right then to completely embrace their ridiculous smear campaign. I would let them sleep soundly at night, wrapped in their delusions of superiority. I would let Devin boast about his fraudulent corporate titles and his flashy lifestyle. I would remain an anonymous phantom, an invisible force, quietly manipulating the markets. Anonymity provided me with unrestricted access to information. Because no one was looking for me, no one saw me coming. I kept my head down and focused strictly on the numbers. I sharpened my skills every day. Those sharpened skills quickly transformed me into the most feared executive in the New York financial district. My partners stopped sending me into standard negotiations and started deploying me as their ultimate weapon. Within the industry, I earned a new title. They called me the Corporate Grim Reaper. Whenever a mid-sized corporation or a bloated technology startup began bleeding capital, my firm bought up their distressed debt and sent me in to handle the execution. I did not negotiate with failing executives. I walked into their mahogany boardrooms, dropped my financial autopsy reports on their tables, and systematically dismantled their entire operations. I fired incompetent management teams without a single ounce of hesitation. I possessed a unique, terrifying ability to look at a tangled web of corporate subsidiaries, offshore accounts, and falsified revenue projections and instantly spot the rot. I stripped away unnecessary departments, liquidated useless assets, and restructured crushing debt loads into profitable margins. I was completely unburdened by emotion or empathy. When you have survived absolute betrayal from your own blood, firing a negligent chief executive officer feels like nothing. I viewed businesses as complex puzzles of cash flow and liabilities. If a component did not generate value, I eliminated it. My aggressive restructuring strategies generated massive returns for my firm, and my personal wealth skyrocketed accordingly. I finally purchased a breathtaking luxury penthouse in a highly secure exclusive building in Manhattan. I paid entirely in cash. The residence featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, private elevator access, and a dedicated security detail. It was a fortress of solitude and success. My family, of course, had absolutely no idea. They still believed the pathetic fiction my mother had spun about my mental collapse and extreme poverty. I allowed them to keep their delusions while I quietly enjoyed the highest echelon of corporate luxury. I did not flaunt my wealth. I found public displays of money incredibly distasteful. Unfortunately, my sister and her husband held the exact opposite philosophy. I kept a quiet, anonymous eye on their public social media profiles. Ashley and Devin were completely addicted to the validation of their followers. Their digital footprint was an endless, nauseating parade of extreme wealth exhibition. Devin, presenting himself as the brilliant, trailblazing African-American financial genius, constantly posted videos from the deck of a newly purchased luxury yacht. He smoked imported cigars and tagged his locations at the most exclusive private marinas. Ashley treated her online presence like a reality television show. She regularly posted unboxing videos featuring $20,000 designer handbags. She flaunted diamond tennis bracelets, documented their extensive renovations on a second vacation home, and posted receipts of their extravagant dining experiences. They wanted the entire world to know they had made it. My parents frequently commented on every single photo, praising Devin for his business acumen and calling Ashley a true inspiration. I sat in my pristine penthouse one evening sipping a glass of vintage wine and looked at their digital circus with my highly trained financial eye. My mind automatically began to run the numbers. I treated their public lifestyle exactly like one of my corporate restructuring targets. I calculated the average maintenance costs, docking fees, and insurance premiums for a luxury yacht. I estimated the property taxes and mortgage rates on their primary residence and their new vacation home. I tallied up the cost of Ashley's designer wardrobe, the frequent international first-class flights, and the high-end vehicles they showcased. I built a comprehensive mental spreadsheet of their annual burn rate. Then I cross-referenced those expenditures against their actual professional positions. Devin was the chief financial officer of a lifestyle startup. Ashley was their vice president of marketing. I knew the exact compensation brackets for those roles in the current corporate market. Even with aggressive equity packages and maximum performance bonuses, their legitimate combined income could never sustain that level of astronomical spending. The math simply did not add up. They were hemorrhaging cash at a rate reserved for billionaires, not mid-level startup executives. Startups are notoriously cash poor, relying heavily on venture capital funding rounds to keep the lights on until they reach profitability. A startup chief financial officer does not have the liquid capital to casually purchase a yacht. A cold, sharp realization settled over me. There was only one way Devon could afford to finance that specific lifestyle. He had to be redirecting company funds. The extravagant trips, the $20,000 handbags, and the boat were not the fruits of his brilliant labor. They were massive, glaring red flags of corporate embezzlement. He was using his position as chief financial officer to siphon venture capital directly into his own pockets. My parents were proudly financing their own delusion by worshiping a man who was committing blatant federal wire fraud. I stared at the photograph of Devon smiling on his yacht, and a dangerous, predatory thrill washed over me. He was sloppy. He was arrogant. He was leaving a massive trail of financial evidence hidden in plain sight. I opened a completely secure secondary window on my computer and deliberately began downloading every public image they posted. I created a heavily encrypted directory specifically designed to archive their digital arrogance. I saved the receipts, the timestamps, and the geographical coordinates. I watched my sister pose in front of a private jet that she could never afford wearing stolen diamonds. The sheer audacity of their behavior was breathtaking. They were openly mocking the entire financial regulatory system without even realizing it. I poured myself another glass of wine and smiled. Their spectacular downfall was now guaranteed. Their house of cards would collapse under its own weight. I simply did not need to intervene. I just needed to wait for the inevitable moment when their stolen capital ran out and the creditors came knocking. I closed my laptop and went to sleep knowing that the ultimate reckoning was already in motion. 7 years passed since the rain-soaked morning I walked away from my family. I was now 34 years old and officially a senior partner at the firm. I had cornered the market on corporate restructuring, turning absolute ruins into highly profitable empires. My corner office on the 60th floor featured floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling financial district of Manhattan. The heavy mahogany door to my suite remained closed to anyone below the executive tier. I commanded a team of 30 ruthless analysts and junior partners who anticipated my every directive. I did not take vacations. I did not waste time on trivial social engagements. I lived entirely for the execution of flawless financial strategies. I had cultivated a reputation as an apex predator in the private equity sector. When my name appeared on a term sheet, chief executive officers knew their company was about to be gutted, cleaned and sold piece by piece to the highest bidder. The terrified, soaking wet, 27-year-old girl running through the subway terminal was completely gone forever. In her place stood a woman forged in absolute isolation and relentless financial discipline. I had reached the absolute undeniable peak of my industry, completely undetected by the people who shared my blood. My parents still firmly believed I was a destitute failure, suffering from permanent mental instability. I allowed them to keep their comforting lies while I quietly accumulated vast wealth and unyielding authority. My entire existence was dedicated to achieving absolute perfection in every single corporate transaction I handled. I became an unstoppable, dominant force of nature. It was a standard Thursday morning when the universe finally delivered the perfect collision of my past and my present. My lead acquisitions manager walked into my office and placed a thick black portfolio directly on the center of my pristine desk. It was a distressed asset file marked for a highly aggressive potential hostile takeover. The target company was called Lux Life. It was a high-end lifestyle and wellness brand that had initially captured massive market share through aggressive social media marketing and celebrity endorsements. The manager briefed me quickly before leaving the room. Lux Life was actively bleeding cash at an unprecedented catastrophic rate. They had secured massive rounds of venture capital funding over the past 3 years. But their operational costs were inexplicably soaring, while their actual profit margins plummeted into the abyss. They were currently defaulting on multiple high-interest commercial loans and desperately seeking an emergency financial bailout to avoid total corporate bankruptcy. Our firm was their absolute last resort. If we did not inject capital and assume controlling interest within the next 14 days, the company would be completely liquidated. Furthermore, their executive board would face severe federal scrutiny for gross financial negligence, massive corporate waste, and massive potential investor fraud. I waited for the manager to close the heavy door before I reached for the black portfolio. I opened the thick leather cover and began scanning the executive summary. My eyes darted across the pages, instantly absorbing the catastrophic data. The revenue projections were absolute garbage, completely fabricated to artificially inflate the overall company valuation. The operational burn rate was staggering, indicating a complete lack of internal financial controls or basic accounting ethics. Millions of dollars were categorized under vague, undefined consulting fees and external marketing ventures. It was an absolute mess of corporate mismanagement. The balance sheet looked exactly like a financial crime scene waiting to be uncovered by federal auditors. The magnitude of the financial negligence was genuinely offensive to my professional sensibilities. I turned the page to the organizational chart to see exactly who was responsible for driving a highly lucrative brand straight into the ground. My eyes tracked down the detailed list of executive officers, carefully evaluating their credentials and exorbitant compensation packages. I stopped breathing. The air in my corner office suddenly went perfectly still. I stared at the crisp, black ink printed on the high-quality paper. I read the names twice to ensure my mind was not playing tricks on me. Vice President of Marketing, Ashley. Chief Financial Officer, Devin. The names jumped off the page like a glaring neon sign warning of impending disaster. I sat back in my leather executive chair and stared at the ceiling. The sheer, terrifying irony of the situation washed over me in a massive, breathtaking wave of sudden realization. The golden child who had dropped a diaper bag at my feet and ordered me not to ruin her weekend was now the vice president of marketing responsible for burning millions of investor dollars on fake campaigns. The arrogant man who mocked my discount clothes and paraded around on a luxury yacht funded by stolen money was the chief financial officer begging my firm to save him from federal prison. They had come to the absolute most ruthless private equity firm in Manhattan, desperately pleading for a multi-million-dollar lifeline to maintain their fraudulent suburban paradise. They had submitted their heavily manipulated financial records, hoping to fool a team of anonymous corporate investors. They had absolutely no idea that the senior partner assigned to audit their books, determine their absolute fate, and ultimately control their entire corporate existence was the exact same sister they had discarded like trash 7 years ago. I looked back down at the executive summary featuring their smiling, arrogant corporate headshots. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering familial obligation or lingering childhood guilt. A cold, deeply predatory smile spread across my face. They thought they had buried me. They did not know they had simply planted a seed, sending me straight to the absolute top of the financial food chain. And now they were walking blindly right into my completely inescapable corporate slaughterhouse. I picked up my heavy gold fountain pen and deliberately signed my initials on the front cover of the file, officially claiming the target. Let the hostile games begin. I immediately locked down the entire acquisition process under a strict shroud of absolute secrecy. In the world of high-stakes private equity, revealing your identity before the trap snaps shut is a fatal amateur mistake. I directed my executive assistant to draft the preliminary letters of intent using our standard corporate letterhead, explicitly omitting my signature entirely. I assigned a ruthless external proxy lawyer to act as the primary point of contact for the executive board of Lux Life. He was a towering, intimidating corporate litigator who specialized in aggressive negotiations and asked absolutely no questions about my underlying motives. He would handle all the video conferences, the demanding emails, and the initial legal posturing. As far as Ashley and Devin knew, their desperate plea for a financial bailout was being evaluated by a faceless committee of aging corporate men sitting in a sterile boardroom. They believed they were successfully charming a standard group of naive investors. They had no idea that every single document, every fabricated revenue projection, and every desperate email they submitted was being routed directly to my secure private server. I became an invisible predator circling my prey. I instructed my proxy lawyer to demand full, unredacted access to their general ledger and all internal expense reports for the past 36 months, claiming it was a mandatory prerequisite for our funding approval. Devin, blinded by his own panic and staggering arrogance, complied without a single fight. He enthusiastically handed over the keys to his completely fraudulent kingdom. The massive data dump arrived on my secure terminal precisely at midnight. I dismissed my entire analytical team, locked my office doors, and carried the heavily encrypted hard drive back to my minimalist luxury penthouse. I brewed a massive pot of dark roast espresso and sat down at my expansive glass desk. The glowing monitors illuminated the dark room as the clock slowly ticked toward 3 in the morning. I plunged headfirst into the raw financial disclosures of Lux Life. An ordinary analyst would have looked at the massive revenue deficits and quickly dismissed the company as a total failure, moving on to a safer asset. I was not an ordinary analyst. I was performing a highly aggressive financial autopsy on the very people who had deliberately destroyed my youth. I tore through the corporate tax filings, the vendor invoices, and the bloated payroll records with cold mechanical precision. Every single number told a desperate, pathetic story of unchecked greed. The company had initially generated massive consumer interest, securing tens of millions in venture capital funding, but the executive team had treated that capital like an unlimited personal bank account. They lacked any fundamental understanding of corporate governance or fiduciary duty. They were simply teenagers playing dress-up with millions of dollars that belonged to institutional investors. The gross mismanagement was so blatant, it was practically screaming off the glowing screens. I needed to isolate the primary source of the aggressive cash bleed before exposing the deeper systemic rot. I decided to aggressively target the marketing department first. It was the massive division controlled entirely by my spoiled golden child sister. Ashley had been handed the title of vice president despite having absolutely zero formal education in business strategy or consumer analytics. I opened her comprehensive monthly budget report and immediately burst into cold, cynical laughter. Her entire divisional strategy was a massive masterpiece of staggering incompetence. According to the official corporate ledger, the marketing department was burning through $2 million every single quarter, yet their actual customer acquisition rate was virtually non-existent within the market. She had bloated her staff with useless lifestyle consultants, personal assistants, and expensive party planners. Instead of purchasing targeted digital advertisements or securing viable retail partnerships, she was throwing massive, pointless industry parties simply to boost her own personal social status. I meticulously cross-referenced the company credit card statements assigned directly to her name against the official promotional calendar. The overlap was incredibly damning. Every single time she posted a glamorous vacation photo on her private social media accounts, a massive corporate expense was simultaneously logged into the company books. She thought she was being clever by hiding her personal vanity projects behind vague corporate terminology. I highlighted line after line of fraudulent expenditures. The sheer arrogant audacity of her endless entitlement was breathtaking. She genuinely believed that because she possessed a lofty corporate title, the basic rules of financial accountability simply did not apply to her daily operations whatsoever. I zoomed in on the most flagrant violations buried deep within her extensive corporate expense reports. I found a massive charge for first-class round-trip tickets to Paris, accompanied by a luxury hotel stay at a 5-star boutique resort. Ashley had boldly labeled this lavish $50,000 European vacation under the incredibly vague category of influencer outreach and brand networking. A few pages later, I uncovered an outrageous receipt from a high-end boutique located in Manhattan. She had charged a staggering $50,000 jewelry spree directly to the startup, claiming the diamond bracelets and gold necklaces were essential expenditures for brand marketing and corporate aesthetic development. The absolute incompetence displayed on these pages was truly staggering. She was blatantly stealing cash from her own corporate investors to play pretend on the internet. But as I continued to dig into the general ledger, a much darker reality began to emerge. Ashley was incredibly foolish, but her sisterly greed was nothing compared to the massive financial deception orchestrated by her husband. Her petty theft was merely the absolute tip of a deeply terrifying iceberg. The money she was burning was coming from a highly complex network of offshore holding companies. Devin, the brilliantly arrogant chief financial officer, was moving capital in ways that Ashley could never possibly comprehend. As the bright morning sun finally began to rise over the sleeping city, I opened the main treasury files and prepared to completely decimate my brother-in-law. I walked into the firm at 7 in the morning carrying the encrypted hard drive like a loaded weapon. The executive floor was completely silent, but my elite team of forensic accountants was already assembled in the secure briefing room. I did not bother with pleasantries or morning greetings. I plugged the drive into the main terminal and projected the corrupted financial ledgers onto the massive wall screens. My team consisted of former federal agents and the most aggressive corporate auditors in the city. They were trained to hunt hidden assets and dismantle complex financial crimes. I pointed a laser pointer directly at the treasury files associated with the chief financial officer. I looked around the room at my specialized team and gave them one single unwavering directive. I told them to ignore the petty marketing waste and follow the wire transfers of the chief financial officer exclusively. I wanted every single external corporate account, every offshore holding entity, and every hidden transaction traced back to its absolute origin. I demanded a complete forensic map of his entire financial network within 48 hours. They immediately went to work unleashing their proprietary tracing software on the corrupted general ledger. While my team tore through the digital transaction history, I returned to my corner office and stared out at the sprawling city. My mind automatically drifted back to the suffocating family dinners we used to have before my escape. I vividly remembered sitting at the long mahogany dining table, listening to Devin hold court. He loved to position himself as a financial visionary, an absolute titan of modern wealth management. He would constantly brag about his complex offshore investment strategies to my highly impressed parents. He spoke loudly about optimizing tax burdens and leveraging international corporate structures. My father would hang on his every word, treating Devin like a reigning king of Wall Street. Devin loved to use those moments to humiliate me publicly. He would look at my tired eyes and my cheap business suit swirling his expensive imported cognac with a condescending smirk. He would shake his head and loudly pity me for working what he called a pathetic wage slave job. He told the entire table that real wealth was never built by clocking hours for a corporate boss. He insisted that people like me were destined to stay poor because we lacked the necessary vision to manipulate the global market. My parents would nod eagerly, agreeing that I lacked the intelligence to understand high-level finance. I never argued with him during those dinners. I just sat quietly eating my food, absorbing every single insult. I knew even back then that his arrogant posturing masked a deep, fundamental ignorance of actual economic principles. He used buzzwords to sound sophisticated, but his understanding of corporate finance was entirely superficial. He was a charismatic salesman playing the role of a financial executive. Now, sitting in my penthouse office, I knew my silent patience was about to pay off in the most devastating way possible. 2 days later, my lead forensic auditor walked into my office. He did not smile. He handed me a thick red folder containing the final financial mapping report. He told me the entire corporate structure of the target company was a massive, highly illegal illusion. The numbers were worse than I could have ever imagined. The audit revealed exactly how Devin was funding his luxury yachts and international vacations. He had systematically set up a complex web of over 20 dummy limited liability companies, registered in various tax havens. He was taking the massive venture capital injections intended for product development and corporate expansion and wiring the funds directly into these ghost entities. He categorized the illegal transfers as external vendor payments, consulting retainers, and international software licensing fees. Once the stolen capital hit the offshore accounts, Devon would immediately launder the money back into his own personal domestic trusts. He was actively using millions of dollars of investor money to personally fund his and Ashley's lavish lifestyle. It was not a case of poor management or aggressive accounting errors. It was textbook wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement on a federal level. My auditor pointed to the specific transaction logs detailing the transfer of funds used to purchase the yacht Devon flaunted online. The money trail was completely undeniable. The digital fingerprints of the chief financial officer were permanently stamped all over every single fraudulent wire transfer. He had left a glaring trail of digital evidence that any competent federal investigator would uncover in an hour. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to project immense wealth that he believed he was untouchable. He thought he could outsmart the entire financial system simply because no one had ever challenged him before. I closed the red folder and placed my hands flat on my glass desk. The sheer magnitude of his financial crimes meant he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He had actively defrauded major institutional investors, falsified corporate tax returns, and committed interstate wire fraud. There was absolutely no corporate loophole or legal maneuver that could save him from the staggering legal consequences of his actions. I realized that my sister and my brother-in-law were not just facing a corporate termination or a hostile takeover. They were facing the absolute destruction of their entire existence. The golden child and her supposedly brilliant husband were about to lose their freedom, their assets, and their carefully cultivated social standing. I instructed my specialized audit team to carefully compile the raw data into two entirely separate formats. The first format was a standard corporate review for our acquisitions committee to officially justify the hostile buyout. The second format was a heavily detailed, legally binding criminal dossier. I was going to hand the chief financial officer his own personal death warrant perfectly wrapped in the exact same absolute arrogance he had always used against me, sealing his fate forever. While my forensic team finalized the criminal dossier, the reality of the situation over at the target company rapidly deteriorated. Lux Life was completely out of capital. Their vendors were halting shipments, and their corporate payroll accounts were dangerously close to overdrawing. I monitored the daily cash flow reports bouncing across my glowing monitors, watching the exact moment the panic truly set in for the chief financial officer. Devon began aggressively hounding my proxy lawyer. He called our external legal counsel 5 times a day, practically begging for the acquisition to close immediately. He offered massive, unprecedented concessions on the company valuation. He expressed a desperate willingness to sign over major corporate assets without any standard pushback. It was the pathetic, frantic behavior of a man standing on a trapdoor with a rope wrapped tightly around his neck. Devon was not trying to save the company for the sake of the loyal employees or the early investors. He was desperately trying to force our massive capital injection through the banking system to cover up the gaping crater of stolen funds he had personally created. He desperately needed our buyout money to replenish the looted corporate treasury before the upcoming quarterly board meeting exposed his massive embezzlement. If the acquisition stalled for even one more week, his entire financial fraud would be laid bare for the primary venture capitalist to see. He was running completely out of time and options. As a mandatory part of the standard corporate due diligence process, my firm legally acquired complete administrative access to all internal corporate communications at Lux Life. We needed to properly evaluate executive competency and internal day-to-day operations before assuming financial liability. I spent the entire weekend sitting alone in my quiet penthouse, systematically scrolling through the raw, unfiltered corporate email servers. I specifically isolated the communication channels between the chief financial officer and the vice president of marketing. I read the frantic, completely unhinged messages Devin was sending to my sister behind closed, heavily guarded doors. The arrogant facade of their perfect, wealthy suburban marriage was entirely absent in these private digital exchanges. Devin was absolutely losing his mind with fear. I found an email sent at 2 in the morning typed entirely in panicked capital letters. Ashley, you need to stop spending company money right now, Devin wrote, his sheer terror radiating through the screen. I cannot hide these corporate credit card charges anymore. The external auditors from the private equity firm are demanding itemized receipts for every single transaction. If this pending acquisition does not go through by Friday, we lose the primary house. We lose the luxury boat. We lose absolutely everything we have built. Do not buy another designer bag. Do not book another international flight. You are going to get us both completely ruined. I leaned back in my leather chair and smiled coldly, reading my sister's incredibly arrogant, dismissive reply. She told him to stop being so hopelessly dramatic and to just do his job and fix the numbers like a real executive. She fiercely reminded him that our parents were coming to visit the new vacation house this upcoming weekend, and she absolutely needed a new designer wardrobe for the planned family photos. She was completely hopelessly oblivious to the federal prison sentence hovering directly over her husband's head. The sheer, blinding ignorance of my family was an incredibly powerful weapon. They had spent their entire lives treating me like an incompetent, worthless servant, assuming I lacked the basic intelligence to understand their supposedly superior world. Now their complete inability to understand the catastrophic consequences of their own financial actions was handing me the ultimate undeniable victory. I compiled the final executive review and called an immediate meeting with the senior acquisitions committee at my firm. I presented the detailed financial models, deliberately omitting the separate criminal dossier I had carefully built on Devin. I outlined a ruthless, highly profitable restructuring plan for the entire lifestyle brand. I showed the senior committee exactly how we could acquire the struggling company for a mere fraction of its actual market value, immediately liquidate the bloated executive compensation packages, and turn a massive, unprecedented profit within 12 short months. The board of directors unanimously voted in my favor without a single objection. They granted me full, unrestricted executive authority to execute the hostile takeover on my own terms. I walked back to my office and immediately authorized the massive transfer of funds. My firm officially purchased a 60% controlling interest in Lux Life. The ink quickly dried on the digital contracts, transferring absolute, undeniable executive power directly into my awaiting hands. I was no longer an invisible financial analyst or a discarded, unloved daughter. I was now legally the majority stakeholder of their entire corporate existence. I owned their employment contracts. I owned their inflated salaries. I owned their entire professional futures. The intricate trap was now fully set, and the desperate prey had eagerly, willingly locked themselves inside. I instructed my legal team to finalize the transition paperwork and prepare the termination protocols. I wanted every single legal detail to be absolutely airtight, leaving no room for negotiation or escape. The absolute power of the acquisition flowed through my veins, replacing years of bitter rejection with the cold, hard reality of corporate dominance. I had successfully bought the very company that sustained their miserable, fraudulent lives. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline, visualizing the exact moment they would walk into my boardroom and realize the horrific truth. They had sold their souls to the exact same girl they had thrown into the rain 7 years ago, and I was fully prepared to collect my absolute due. I meticulously organized the damning financial documents, placing the forensic audit securely inside a heavy leather binder. Everything was perfectly arranged for the upcoming executive meeting. The corporate execution of my extremely arrogant family members was finally about to begin tomorrow morning, without mercy or hesitation at all. I placed 2 empty folders on the polished glass surface of my desk. The physical preparation of their destruction required absolute precision. I picked up the first folder, a slim, dark blue binder. Inside, I placed the standard corporate termination documents for the vice president of marketing. I included a detailed separation agreement that explicitly denied any severance package, revoked all unvested equity shares, and immediately terminated her company health insurance. I attached a formal demand for the immediate return of all corporate assets, including the company credit cards she had been using to fund her luxury shopping sprees. Ashley was going to walk into my boardroom, expecting a massive retention bonus, and walk out with absolutely nothing. I smoothed my hand over the blue cover, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This one was not slim. It was a massive heavy red binder containing over 300 pages of devastating forensic accounting data. This was the comprehensive criminal dossier I had meticulously built against the chief financial officer. I loaded the first section with the direct wire transfer receipts linking Devon to the offshore shell companies. I filled the middle section with the falsified tax documents and the heavily manipulated quarterly earnings reports. The final section contained the completed referral forms for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the formal complaint already drafted for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had cross-referenced every single stolen dollar. I placed the heavily encrypted flash drive containing the raw digital evidence into a plastic sleeve and secured it inside the front cover. This red binder was a fully loaded weapon. Devon was going to sit down expecting to negotiate his executive survival, completely unaware that he was looking at a guaranteed 10-year federal prison sentence. I aligned the blue folder and the red binder side by side on my desk. The traps were fully armed and ready to snap shut. I buzzed my executive assistant and instructed her to connect me to my external proxy lawyer. I told him it was time to initiate the final phase of the acquisition protocol. I instructed him to formally invite the LuxLife executive team to our Manhattan headquarters for an emergency restructuring meeting. I placed the phone on speaker and listened silently as he dialed the direct line of the chief financial officer. Devon answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with forced confidence and barely concealed panic. My proxy lawyer introduced himself and delivered the scripted message flawlessly. He informed Devon that our private equity firm had officially secured the 60% controlling interest in the brand. He then stated that the new senior controlling partner required the immediate presence of the executive team tomorrow morning to discuss the financial transition and sign the final restructuring agreements. I listened to the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Devon tried to mask his massive relief, but his voice cracked slightly as he responded. He eagerly accepted the invitation, assuring the lawyer that he and the vice president of marketing would be on the first morning flight to New York. Devon actually had the audacity to suggest that he and the new senior partner would likely find a lot of common ground regarding the future vision of the company. He boasted that he had prepared a presentation to highlight his strategic value to the new ownership group. I sat in my quiet office and smiled coldly at his staggering arrogance. He genuinely thought he was walking into a victory lap. He truly believed he had successfully conned another group of wealthy corporate investors. My proxy lawyer agreed to the time, ended the call, and confirmed the targets were officially in motion. That evening, I walked into my expansive closet to select my armor for the upcoming execution. I bypassed the standard business attire and reached for a pristine, incredibly sharp tailored suit I had commissioned from an exclusive Italian designer in the city. The charcoal gray wool blend cost exactly $4,000. It was cut with aggressive, clean lines that projected absolute, unyielding authority. I laid the suit out perfectly, pairing it with a crisp silk blouse and a pair of formidable black leather stilettos. Every single element of the outfit was chosen to completely dominate the physical space of the boardroom. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of my financial power the exact second they laid eyes on me. I wanted their inherent superiority complex to shatter instantly. I dressed slowly the next morning, securing every button and adjusting the sharp lapels of the jacket. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror in my bedroom and stared directly at my own reflection. I looked at the sleek, powerful senior partner staring back at me. My mind immediately flashed back to a vivid memory from 7 years ago. I saw the terrified, soaking wet 27-year-old girl standing in a cheap, ruined discount store blazer. I remembered the freezing rain soaking through my clothes as I ran desperately through the flooded streets of the city. I remembered the crushing weight of the diaper bag my sister had dropped at my feet. I remembered the sound of my father laughing as he told me I did not deserve a life. I remembered the cold, malicious glare of my mother as she blocked the door and tried to destroy my only chance at a future. I looked back at the reflection of the woman standing in the $4,000 suit. I raised my chin slightly. The scared, vulnerable girl who let her family dictate her worth was completely gone. She died in the freezing rain 7 years ago. The woman standing in the mirror was the corporate Grim Reaper, and she was ready to collect her due. I grabbed my briefcase, locked the penthouse door behind me, and stepped into the private elevator to begin the final phase of my revenge. I arrived at the headquarters exactly 1 hour before the scheduled meeting. The executive suite on the 40th floor was completely silent, operating with the hushed efficiency of a financial institution. I walked past the reception desk, giving a brief nod to my assistant, and stepped directly into the primary glass-walled boardroom. The space was massive, deliberately designed to intimidate and overwhelm visiting corporate executives. A long, flawlessly polished mahogany table dominated the center of the expansive room, surrounded by ergonomic black leather chairs. I placed my heavy briefcase on the smooth surface and carefully extracted the two critical folders. I set the slim blue folder and the incredibly thick red binder perfectly parallel at the head of the table. I sat down in the high-backed executive chair, feeling the cool leather press against my sharp-tailored jacket. I spun the chair slowly, turning my back entirely to the heavy double doors of the entrance. I faced the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, waking city of Manhattan. The bright morning sun reflected sharply off the surrounding skyscrapers, casting sharp, angular shadows across the boardroom floor. I sat perfectly still, listening to the faint, steady hum of the climate control system. My breathing was incredibly slow and perfectly measured. I mentally reviewed every single financial metric, every hidden fraudulent transaction, and every strict termination clause. I was a dominant predator, waiting patiently in the absolute silence of my own specialized domain. The intricate trap was set perfectly, and the targets were currently riding the elevator straight up to their ultimate inescapable destruction. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors swung open loudly. I heard the distinct sharp click of expensive high heels stepping proudly onto the polished hardwood floor, accompanied immediately by the heavy, confident stride of custom leather loafers. My proxy lawyer entered first, his deep voice booming confidently across the expansive room as he formally introduced the executive team of Lux Life to the new controlling senior partner. I remained firmly facing the window, my back completely turned to the room. I listened closely as Ashley and Devin walked further into the boardroom. They did not hesitate for a single second. Their footsteps echoed with staggering, completely unearned confidence. I could practically feel the overwhelming arrogance radiating from them both. They were completely convinced they had just secured a massive financial bailout from a faceless, gullible corporate entity. I heard Ashley laugh, a high-pitched, heavily manufactured sound deliberately designed to project casual charm. She immediately began complimenting the stunning view and the luxurious decor, desperately attempting to flatter whoever was sitting quietly in the high-backed chair. Devin spoke next, his tone dripping with the arrogant, aggressive swagger of a chief financial officer who genuinely believed he was the absolute smartest person in the entire building. He loudly directed his wife to sit near the center of the table, positioning himself aggressively to dominate the upcoming negotiation. I heard the distinct rustle of expensive fabric as they settled comfortably into their seats. They were undoubtedly wearing their absolute most extravagant designer clothes, armed with luxury watches and tailored silhouettes, oblivious to the fact that their wealthy facade was built entirely on stolen venture capital. They sat there comfortably, adjusting their fraudulent corporate armor, fully expecting me to turn around and shower them with unearned venture capital and endless corporate praise. My proxy lawyer cleared his throat loudly, officially signaling that the guests were properly seated and completely ready to begin the final financial transition briefing. The massive room fell into a heavy, highly expectant silence. Devin impatiently tapped his expensive gold pen against the mahogany table, creating a sharp, highly demanding rhythm that aggressively requested my immediate, undivided attention. I placed my hands firmly on the smooth armrests of my leather chair. I did not rush the moment at all. I executed the movement with incredibly cold, highly deliberate precision. I slowly swiveled my chair around to face the exact center of the long table. The quiet mechanical glide of the chair was the absolute only sound heard in the massive tension-filled boardroom. I brought my hands up, slowly folding them perfectly over the blue and red folders resting ominously in front of me. I raised my chin slightly and locked my eyes directly onto the two stunned executives sitting across from me. I held their panicked gaze with the freezing, undeniable authority of a senior corporate partner who legally owned their entire professional lives. The sheer power of the silence was completely deafening as the horrible truth finally began to register in their minds. The visceral reaction was instantaneous and absolutely devastating to watch unfold. Ashley froze completely solid in her seat. Her manicured hands stopped moving mid-air. The highly confident, heavily practiced corporate smile shattered, instantly wiped entirely from her face in a single second. The color drained entirely from her skin, leaving her looking exactly like a terrified, hollow ghost. Her eyes widened in sheer horror as her brain violently struggled to process the mathematically impossible reality sitting calmly right in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. She just stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic collapse of her entire heavily fabricated universe. Devin reacted very differently. He looked deeply confused at first. His highly arrogant practiced smirk, faltering sharply as he failed to recognize me immediately. He glanced at Ashley, directly observing her absolute paralyzing panic, and then looked right back at me. His deep confusion rapidly morphed into a burning, highly defensive anger. His face flushed bright red as his massive ego violently rejected the undeniable reality of the situation. He gripped the edge of the polished mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white, utterly unable to properly comprehend how the pathetic, permanently discarded sister had somehow miraculously become the undisputed apex predator, holding the final keys to his entirely fraudulent corporate kingdom. The heavy silence stretched across the expansive boardroom for several excruciating seconds. Ashley desperately fought to regain control of her shattered reality. Her survival mechanism immediately defaulted to the exact same aggressive entitlement she had utilized her entire life. She refused to accept the visual evidence sitting directly in front of her. She forced a harsh, incredibly brittle laugh that echoed sharply off the glass walls. She practically threw her expensive designer bag onto the polished mahogany table and glared at me with absolute contempt. "Samantha, what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with heavy condescension. "Did Dad finally get you a job as a secretary in this building? I knew you were struggling, but this is honestly pathetic. We are in the middle of highly classified corporate business. Go fetch us some coffee. We are waiting for the senior partner to arrive and evaluate our company." She actually waved her manicured hand in the air, physically shooing me away like a bothersome insect. She desperately needed to believe I was merely administrative staff. She needed the familiar dynamic of me serving her to anchor her collapsing mind. Devin immediately caught his wife's defensive rhythm. He eagerly latched on to the absurd narrative she had just constructed to protect his own massive, incredibly fragile ego. He shifted his broad shoulders confidently and leaned back into the expensive leather chair. He arrogantly adjusted the heavy diamond-encrusted Rolex resting on his left wrist. He projected the absolute swagger of a wealthy chief financial officer who believed he controlled the entire financial universe. "Still running errands?" Little Sister Devin sneered, flashing a highly manufactured, patronizing smile. "You heard your sister. Go tell your boss the chief financial officer of Lux Life is incredibly busy today and simply does not have the time to wait around for late executives. We have a multi-million-dollar acquisition to close. Be a good girl and bring us sparkling water while we wait for the real professionals to enter the room. Their sheer unfiltered arrogance was absolutely breathtaking. They were literally sitting in a corporate slaughterhouse, utterly surrounded by their own massive financial crimes, and their very first instinct was to brutally degrade the only person in the room holding a loaded weapon. 7 years ago, those exact same degrading words would have completely crushed my spirit. 7 years ago, I would have lowered my eyes, apologized for my mere existence, and quietly walked out of the room to fetch their drinks. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of emotional weakness. I remained perfectly seated in my high-backed leather chair, my posture absolutely rigid and commanding. I looked at the two pathetic, deeply compromised individuals sitting across from me, and I felt nothing but cold clinical detachment. I was observing two severely damaged financial assets ready for immediate liquidation. I reached forward with slow, highly deliberate precision. I extended my right index finger and firmly pressed the glowing silver button on the brushed metal intercom system integrated directly into my desk console. The sharp beep echoed clearly through the massive boardroom. Security! I stated, my voice echoing with freezing, undeniable authority. Lock down the executive elevators immediately. Disable all stairwell access badges. No one leaves this floor under any circumstances without my direct, explicit authorization. A crisp, highly professional voice immediately responded through the intercom speaker. Copy that. The entire floor is fully locked down. Ashley stopped breathing. Her arrogant smirk vanished instantly. Devin dropped his hands from the table, his posture stiffening as the heavy reality of the security lockdown crashed over him. He looked wildly at the heavy mahogany doors, realizing they were now trapped inside the glass walls of my designated territory. I calmly lifted my hands from the table. I picked up the master corporate acquisition contract from the pristine surface of my desk. The document was thick-bound in heavy legal paper and prominently featured the official corporate seal of my highly exclusive private equity firm. I placed my manicured fingers on the binding and smoothly, forcefully slid the massive legal document directly across the polished mahogany table. The heavy paper coasted flawlessly across the wood, stopping precisely an inch away from Devin and his expensive watch. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, closing the physical distance between us. I locked my eyes directly onto Devin, ensuring he felt the crushing weight of my absolute corporate dominance. I am the senior partner. I declared, my voice echoing with terrifying lethal clarity. I do not fetch coffee, Devin. I fetch corrupted corporations. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, my firm officially executed the hostile buyout protocol. I own 60% of your company. I watched the exact moment their entire fraudulent universe completely imploded. The profound, overwhelming shock violently struck them both simultaneously. Ashley physically recoiled, her back slamming hard against her leather chair, as if she had just been struck by a speeding vehicle. She stared blindly at the massive acquisition contract resting ominously on the table. The words printed on the cover page burned into her retinas. Devin began to sweat. Small, rapid beads of perspiration formed along his hairline. He instinctively reached for the thick contract, his hands trembling visibly. He flipped open the heavy cover page, his eyes desperately scanning the legally binding signatures and the massive financial figures. He read my name prominently listed as the sole controlling executive authority over his entire brand. They had spent their entire lives treating me like garbage. They had built an entire false reality where they reigned supreme while I supposedly rotted in absolute poverty. Now they were legally bound to the exact woman they had tried to destroy. I owned their salaries. I owned their employment contracts. I owned their entire pathetic lifestyle. I sat quietly and watched them completely drown in their own magnificent, utterly inescapable corporate panic. Ashley stared at the crisp white pages of the master acquisition contract. Her eyes darted wildly across the legal terminology, desperately searching for a loophole or a typographical error that could explain away the absolute nightmare sitting before her. She refused to accept her sudden complete loss of power. She forced another laugh, a jagged, breathless sound that scraped unpleasantly against the heavy silence of the boardroom. Her hands, adorned with expensive diamond rings purchased with stolen venture capital, were shaking so violently that the heavy legal paper rattled against the mahogany table. "This is some kind of elaborate prank," Ashley stammered, her voice pitching an octave higher than normal. "You probably hired a fake lawyer and rented this boardroom just to scare us. Mom and Dad always said you were completely delusional, Samantha. You are literally psychotic. You do not own a private equity firm. You cannot possibly afford to buy Lux Life." I did not entertain her desperate, pathetic delusions. I simply tapped my index finger against the polished wood of the table, drawing her frantic gaze back to the thick document. "Read the third page, Ashley." I instructed, my voice entirely stripped of emotion. "Read the notarized signatures of the institutional investors. Look at the federal tax identification numbers. Look at the authorized corporate seal of my firm. This is not a prank. This is a legally binding hostile takeover, and you are currently sitting in my building." Devin remained completely silent beside her. He had already read the signatures. As a chief financial officer, despite his massive corruption, he recognized an authentic federal acquisition document when he saw one. He knew the paperwork was entirely legitimate. Ashley turned to him, searching his face for reassurance, but she found absolutely nothing. Devin stared blankly at the table, completely paralyzed by fear. The reality finally crashed through her thick wall of entitlement. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The golden child was finally experiencing consequences. I reached forward and picked up the slim blue folder resting on my desk. I opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the suspense suffocate the room. I extracted the comprehensive expense reports I had meticulously analyzed over the weekend. I placed them directly in front of Ashley. I watched her swallow hard as she recognized her own fraudulent divisional budgets printed on the glossy paper. "Let us talk about your professional performance, Vice President of Marketing." I began, my tone razor sharp. "I have spent the last 48 hours conducting a forensic analysis of your departmental expenditures. Your complete lack of basic financial literacy is genuinely astounding. You treated millions of dollars of investor capital like a limitless personal allowance." I slid the first highlighted page toward her shaking hands. "You submitted a massive expense report last quarter detailing a comprehensive digital advertising campaign designed to target European consumer markets," I stated, reading directly from the audit. "You requested and received $200,000 for targeted social media acquisitions." Ashley opened her mouth to defend herself, but I immediately cut her off. "You didn't spend $200,000 on an ad campaign, Ashley. You spent it on a private jet to Mykonos and billed it to the company." I placed the flight manifests and the luxury villa receipts directly on top of her fake marketing report. "You flew yourself and 6 of your suburban friends to Greece for a 2-week luxury vacation. You expensed the champagne, the private chefs, and the yacht rentals. You categorized the entire trip as influencer outreach." I pulled out the next page. I did not give her a single second to recover. "And then there is the Manhattan shopping spree," I continued relentlessly. $50,000 spent at a high-end jewelry boutique. You expensed diamond tennis bracelets and gold necklaces, claiming they were essential expenditures for brand marketing and corporate aesthetic development. You literally bought yourself diamonds, using the operational budget of a failing lifestyle brand. Your entire department has a customer acquisition cost that defies basic economic logic. You have generated absolutely zero legitimate revenue for this company in 36 months. You are not a marketing executive. You are a corporate parasite draining the lifeblood of a distressed asset." Ashley completely broke down. The sheer terror of being exposed stripped away her arrogant facade entirely. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect expensive makeup. She looked at Devin for help, but he was physically shrinking into his chair, trying to make himself invisible to avoid the incoming fire. Realizing she was completely alone, she resorted to the only manipulative tactic she had left. She desperately tried to play the family card. "Samantha, please," Ashley cried, her voice cracking as she leaned forward across the mahogany table. "You cannot do this to me. I have a lifestyle to maintain. I have a public image. What will mom and dad say if you destroy my career? We are blood. You can't do this to me. I'm your sister. She reached her shaking hand out, attempting to grasp my arm in a pathetic display of manufactured sisterly affection. I smoothly pulled my arm back, completely rejecting her touch. I looked at the woman who had dropped a diaper bag at my feet and ordered me not to ruin her weekend. I looked at the golden child who had happily watched my parents throw me onto the street in the freezing rain. I felt absolutely zero empathy. I felt only the cold, satisfying weight of absolute justice. I watched her tears fall heavily onto the wooden table, waiting for the exact right moment to deliver the final crushing blow. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted, placing me firmly at the top of the hierarchy. I took a slow, steady breath, cementing my victory. I don't have a sister, I replied, my voice echoing perfectly cold and unyielding through the massive glass boardroom. I have a grossly incompetent employee who just committed corporate theft. You're fired, effective immediately, without severance. Ashley let out a sharp gasp, collapsing forward onto the mahogany table as the reality of her termination crushed her completely. She buried her tear-streaked face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent sobs. Seeing his wife shattered finally spurred Devin into action. He pushed his chair back, the leather scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood up, puffing out his chest and aggressively straightening his silk tie. He desperately attempted to project the commanding, unassailable authority he always used to intimidate my parents back in our suburban dining room. He slammed his palms flat onto the table and leaned toward me, his face twisting into a mask of pure defiance. "You cannot fire us," Devin demanded, his voice booming with forced bravado. "I am the chief financial officer of this brand. I am the only reason this entire operation is still breathing. I built the financial infrastructure from the ground up. I control the books. If I walk out that door right now, this company sinks into absolute oblivion." I did not even blink at his loud theatrical display of corporate dominance. I slowly shifted my gaze from my sobbing sister directly to her arrogant husband. I reached out and placed both hands firmly on the massive, heavy red binder resting on the table. The silence in the boardroom grew incredibly heavy as I gripped the cover. "You do not control the books, Devin," I stated, my voice slicing through the air with terrifying, icy precision. "You cooked them." I flipped open the cover of the criminal dossier. I grabbed the first massive stack of forensic accounting reports and forcefully slid them across the long table. The glossy pages fanned out perfectly, coming to a halt directly beneath his rigid hands. "Look at the highlighted sections, Chief Financial Officer," I commanded. "Look at the brilliantly hidden corporate subsidiaries you thought no one would ever uncover. You established a network of 20 separate dummy limited liability companies registered in the Cayman Islands, Delaware, and Panama. Let us review the specific entities you used to launder stolen venture capital." I read directly from my executive summary. Apex Holdings, LLC, Vanguard Strategic Ventures, Oceanic Consulting Partners. You wired $4 million to Apex Holdings last November under the guise of an international software licensing acquisition. Except Apex Holdings does not produce software. It is an empty shell registered to a vacant post office box in Grand Cayman, which conveniently funnels cash directly into a private wealth trust bearing your exact social security number. Devin froze completely. The aggressive posture vanished from his body as his eyes locked onto the highlighted bank routing numbers printed clearly on the forensic documents. You authorized another $2 million transfer to Vanguard Strategic Ventures in February. I continued, relentlessly flipping to the next page of undeniable evidence. You categorized that transaction as a vendor payment for supply chain management. My external auditors traced that exact wire transfer. The funds moved from the corporate treasury, bounced through a secondary holding account in Delaware, and landed directly in your personal offshore checking account. 48 hours after that, money cleared, you finalized the purchase of your luxury yacht. You paid in cash. You literally bought a boat using the payroll capital meant for your software engineering department. Your digital fingerprints are permanently burned into every single fraudulent transaction. You left a glaring, amateur trail of metadata connecting your corporate login credentials to every single unauthorized offshore wire transfer. You did not build a financial infrastructure. You built a sloppy, incredibly obvious embezzlement scheme. The profound realization of his absolute destruction hit Devon like a physical blow. He slowly lowered himself into his leather chair, his legs seemingly unable to support his own weight anymore. The arrogant, untouchable executive facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. The diamond-encrusted Rolex suddenly looked ridiculous on his trembling wrist. Massive beads of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, shining under the bright boardroom lights. His skin lost all its color, turning a sickly pale shade of gray. He looked at the forensic evidence stacked before him and finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his situation. He was not looking at a simple termination or a standard corporate lawsuit. He recognized the specific formatting of the documents I provided. He realized that I was not just firing him, I had him dead to rights on massive federal charges. He was looking directly at an airtight, fully documented case of interstate wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and massive corporate embezzlement. Devon swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. He raised his shaking hands in a pathetic gesture of complete surrender. "Samantha, please," he begged, his voice dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper. "You do not understand the pressure I was under. The investors were demanding impossible growth metrics. I just needed to move some capital temporarily to keep the appearance of profitability. I was going to put the money back. I swear to you, I was going to replace every dollar once the next funding round cleared. Please, you have to listen to me. We are family. You cannot hand these files over to the authorities. It will completely ruin our lives. Just keep this in the family. We can fix the books together. I will do whatever you want. I will sign over my equity. I will walk away. Just please keep this strictly in the family." I sat perfectly still, observing sheer panic radiating from his sweating face. I let his desperate plea hang in the air. The man who had mocked my discount clothes and my humble career was now physically trembling, begging for my mercy. He was utterly broken, entirely consumed by the terrifying specter of federal prison. I looked at the weeping executive sitting directly across from me, realizing that all of his fake power had been built entirely on stolen money and desperate lies. I did not offer Devon a single word of comfort. I simply closed the heavy red binder and pulled the master acquisition contract back to my side of the table. "You have exactly 1 hour to clear out your desks," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the massive boardroom. "I have instructed building security to escort you to your respective offices. You will pack only personal effects. Every digital device, corporate credit card, and physical key card remains on your desks. If either of you attempts to access a single corporate computer or delete a single email, I will authorize my legal team to have you detained by local law enforcement before you even reach the lobby. Get out of my sight." Ashley let out a loud, pathetic wail, stumbling backward as she pushed her chair away from the mahogany table. She clutched her expensive designer handbag against her chest like a physical shield, her pristine white trousers looking completely ridiculous against her shattered, tear-stained face. Devon did not try to argue anymore. The sheer overwhelming reality of his federal crimes had completely paralyzed his massive ego. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling so violently that he had to brace his hands against the table just to maintain his balance. The arrogant, untouchable chief financial officer was nothing more than a terrified criminal walking toward his own execution. They turned and dragged themselves toward the heavy double doors, moving like broken shadows of the wealthy executives they pretended to be just an hour ago. Security guards were waiting precisely outside the glass walls, stepping forward immediately to flank them as they began their humiliating march toward the executive elevators. I watched them leave the boardroom feeling an incredibly deep, profound sense of absolute vindication. I gathered my pristine blue and red folders, picked up my heavy leather briefcase, and walked calmly back to my corner office. I sat down in my high-backed chair and turned my attention to the large array of glowing security monitors mounted on the far wall. The feeds captured every angle of the corporate headquarters. I watched Ashley and Devin step off the elevator and stumble directly into the main reception lobby. Ashley completely collapsed into a plush waiting chair, dropping her face into her hands. Devin paced back and forth, frantically pulling at his silk tie, desperately trying to loosen it, as if he were suddenly suffocating. I zoomed the camera feed directly onto Ashley. I watched her pull her phone from her designer bag with wildly shaking hands. I knew exactly who she was calling. The golden child was doing what she had always done her entire life whenever she faced the slightest inconvenience or actual consequence. She was calling her protectors. She was dialing Brenda and Thomas. I watched her press the phone to her ear, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure panic and desperate victimization as she undoubtedly shrieked into the receiver. She was likely screaming that her cruel, jealous sister had somehow stolen her company and destroyed her perfect marriage. I could practically hear the high-pitched, frantic lies pouring from her mouth. She would completely omit the massive corporate embezzlement and the fraudulent offshore accounts. She would frame the entire hostile takeover as a malicious, unprovoked attack born from my supposed mental instability and deep-seated jealousy. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Brenda and Thomas would drop absolutely everything to rescue their precious wealthy daughter and their fake genius son-in-law. They would rush to the city fueled by massive ignorant entitlement, fully believing they could simply bully me into compliance just like they did 7 years ago. They thought they could use their parental authority to force me to reverse a multi-million-dollar private equity acquisition. I pressed the silver button on my intercom system, connecting directly to the main reception desk on the ground floor. When my parents arrive, I instructed the head of security you will allow them to bypass the main lobby protocols. You will grant them direct access to my floor and send them straight to my office. Do not stop them. Let them walk right in. I released the intercom button and leaned back in my leather chair. I opened the top drawer of my desk and retrieved a small, highly advanced digital recording device. I placed it discreetly behind a heavy crystal paperweight, perfectly angled to capture every single sound in the room. I pressed the activation button, confirming the solid red light was blinking steadily. I was fully prepared to document every single threat, every massive manipulation, and every desperate attempt at extortion they were about to deploy. I smoothed the lapels of my $4,000 tailored suit and checked my reflection in the dark monitor screen. I was completely unbothered. I had built an impenetrable fortress of wealth, legal authority, and absolute corporate dominance. They were walking blindly into a highly fortified trap armed with nothing but pathetic guilt trips and completely empty authority. I folded my hands perfectly together on the pristine glass surface of my desk and waited patiently for the incoming storm. I knew they would violently burst through those heavy mahogany doors, fully expecting to find the weak, terrified 27-year-old girl they had heartlessly thrown into the freezing rain 7 long years ago. Instead, they were going to immediately face the absolute corporate Grim Reaper. I kept my cold, unblinking eyes locked directly on the heavy oak doors, quietly watching the bright red seconds tick by slowly on my digital clock. The final family ambush was rapidly approaching, and I was holding absolutely all the necessary keys to initiate their total, undeniable financial destruction. My breathing remained perfectly calm and entirely measured as I eagerly anticipated their frantic, doomed arrival. Every single advantage was mine now, and they were utterly powerless to stop the inevitable catastrophic collision finally heading their way. 45 minutes after I watched Ashley and Devin drag themselves out of my building in utter disgrace, the heavy silence of the executive floor was violently broken. I heard the commotion before I even saw them. The sharp, frantic shrieking of my mother echoed down the pristine marble corridor, completely shattering the quiet, professional atmosphere of the acquisitions department. She was loudly threatening to sue the receptionists, demanding immediate access to the senior partner suite. My father was right behind her, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the floorboards as he barked orders at the security personnel who were deliberately standing down just as I had instructed. They did not even bother knocking. The massive mahogany doors to my corner office were thrown violently open, slamming hard against the interior walls. Brenda and Thomas stormed into the room, their faces completely flushed with rage and manic entitlement. They looked exactly as I remembered them from that freezing rain-soaked morning 7 years ago. Deeply arrogant, entirely consumed by their own fabricated superiority, and completely oblivious to the actual reality of the situation unfolding around them. My father marched straight across the expensive Persian rug, his chest puffed out, fully expecting me to cower, the exact second he entered my domain. My mother followed closely behind him, clutching her designer purse, her eyes darting frantically around the expansive luxury of my private suite, before finally locking onto my face with absolute venom. Thomas did not hesitate. He walked directly up to my desk, raised his right arm, and slammed his heavy fist violently down onto the pristine glass surface. The impact rattled my crystal paperweight, but I did not flinch. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he bellowed, his voice echoing loudly off the floor to ceiling windows. His face was twisted in absolute fury, entirely unable to process the fact that the daughter he discarded was now occupying a seat of immense corporate power. "Rehire your sister right now," he commanded, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You sign off on Devon's budget immediately. Do you hear me? You do not get to walk into their company and throw your weight around just because you managed to secure some low-level finance job. They are running a massive lifestyle brand, Samantha. Devon is an executive. You are going to reverse this ridiculous termination stunt right now, or I will personally call the primary investors of this firm and tell them exactly how unstable you are." He was actually trying to discipline me. He was standing in the very center of my multi-million-dollar corporate fortress, attempting to ground a 34-year-old senior partner as if I were a disobedient teenager who had just missed curfew. He genuinely believed that his parental authority somehow superseded federal acquisition laws and binding corporate contracts. He thought he could simply shout loud enough and I would hand his fraudulent son-in-law the keys to the company vault. Brenda immediately stepped forward to reinforce his completely unhinged demands, perfectly executing her classic emotional manipulation tactics. She slammed her hands on the back of the guest chair, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered disgust. "We are your parents," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "You owe us. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay our kindness. By trying to destroy your own flesh and blood out of pure bitter spite." Ashley is completely devastated. Devon is terrified they will lose their home. Ashley's kids will starve because of your jealousy. You have always been so deeply envious of her success, Samantha. You could never stand the fact that she married a brilliant, successful man while you had absolutely nothing. You are deliberately trying to ruin her perfect life just to make yourself feel important. You will reinstate their executive compensation packages this instant, or you will regret the day you ever decided to cross this family. She gasped for air, her chest heaving with manufactured outrage, completely ignoring the massive red binder of criminal forensic evidence resting just inches away from her hands. They were entirely oblivious to the federal wire fraud and the offshore embezzlement that funded the very lifestyle they were violently defending. They only cared about protecting the golden child and maintaining their fragile, incredibly expensive illusion of suburban supremacy. I sat perfectly still, letting their desperate, pathetic screams fade into the quiet hum of the climate control system. I reached forward, picked up my small porcelain cup, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark espresso. The rich, bitter taste grounded me completely. I placed the cup back onto its saucer with a soft, precise click. I looked at the two sweating, screaming people standing across from me, and I felt absolutely no fear, no guilt, and no lingering childhood trauma. I just felt cold, undeniable power. 7 years ago, you told me I was dead to you because I went to a job interview, I reminded them calmly, my voice remaining perfectly flat and chillingly detached. You locked the front door. You tried to destroy my only chance at a career because you wanted a free babysitter for your precious daughter. You told me my only purpose was to serve Ashley. You threw my belongings into the freezing rain and told the entire family I had suffered a mental breakdown. You erased my existence from your lives completely. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the glass desk, locking my eyes directly onto my father. Now, you are standing in my building begging for my money. You are standing in the center of the empire I built, with my own two hands demanding that I finance the pathetic, completely fraudulent lives of the two worst executives in the entire state. You have no power here. Your authority is totally meaningless. You do not dictate terms to the senior partner who holds the majority stake of your company. Brenda realized her aggressive approach had entirely failed. The screaming immediately ceased as she shifted her strategy. Her features softened dramatically, morphing into a mask of profound, manufactured maternal sorrow. She brought her manicured hands to her face, squeezing her eyes shut, until perfectly timed fake tears began to roll down her cheeks. She took a hesitant step toward my desk, holding her arms open, as if attempting to embrace me through the glass. "Samantha, my sweet girl," she sobbed, her voice trembling with intense, calculated emotion. "You have it all wrong. We never wanted to abandon you. We saw how brilliant you were. We saw that you had this incredible, massive potential buried inside you. We only pushed you away to make you strong. We knew that if we gave you a comfortable life, you would never reach your absolute peak. We sacrificed our relationship with you just to force you to fly. See? It worked. Look at this magnificent office. Look at the immense power you hold today. You became a giant because we gave you the gift of hardship. Now you have enough money to save the family. You can finally take your rightful place as our savior." The sheer audacity of her historical revisionism was genuinely staggering. She was actively trying to rebrand years of emotional abuse, neglect, and financial abandonment as a visionary parenting strategy. She wanted me to believe that locking me out in the freezing rain was an act of profound maternal love. I did not move a single muscle. I looked at her fake tears and felt a wave of profound disgust. "You do not get to claim credit for the fire that burned you," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "You threw me away because I was an inconvenience to your perfect suburban narrative. You do not get to rebrand your cruelty as tough love just because the daughter you discarded suddenly holds the key to your bank accounts." Seeing that Brenda's emotional manipulation had spectacularly crashed and burned, my father instantly lost his temper again. Thomas could never handle a woman defying his authority, let alone his own daughter. He stepped in front of my mother, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He decided to abandon all pretense of family unity and resort directly to pure aggressive extortion. He slammed his hand against his thigh and leveled a furious glare at me. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little brat," Thomas snarled, completely dropping the loving father routine. "You are going to authorize the capital injection for Devon right this second. If you refuse, if you dare to ruin Devon and humiliate your sister, I will go directly to the press. I will call every major financial news outlet in this city. I will grant exclusive interviews telling everyone exactly who you really are. I will tell them you are a vindictive, highly unstable daughter who is actively using her corporate position to carry out a psychotic personal vendetta against her own innocent family. I will paint you as a completely unhinged executive who lost her mind and decided to destroy a promising startup out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. I will call your managing partners. I will call your board of directors. I will make sure everyone in the financial district knows you are a toxic liability. Your entire reputation will be completely annihilated before the market opens tomorrow morning. You will be stripped of your partnership, and you will be back on the street exactly where you belong. Now sign the authorization papers and fix this mess, or I will destroy your career." Thomas stood there, breathing heavily, convinced he had just delivered the ultimate inescapable checkmate. He believed he still held the power to destroy my life with a few well-placed lies. I slowly stood up from my high-backed leather chair. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit towering over the mahogany desk. I did not shout. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I simply raised my right hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the small, heavy crystal paperweight resting on the edge of my desk. Directly behind the crystal, a small red light blinked with a steady, rhythmic pulse. Then I raised my hand higher, pointing toward the upper right corner of the expansive ceiling, where a high-definition security camera was silently tracking every single movement in the room. You really should have done your due diligence before kicking my door down. Thomas, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. You just marched into a highly secure corporate facility and threatened to initiate a fraudulent smear campaign against a corporate executive unless I authorized a massive transfer of capital to a failing company. You are currently attempting to extort a senior partner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm to cover up massive federal wire fraud, I stated clearly, ensuring every single syllable was captured by the digital audio recorder. I could have you arrested right now. I could call federal authorities and hand them the exact audio of you demanding I participate in a massive corporate cover-up. You genuinely believed your parental title granted you total immunity from federal extortion laws. You thought you could walk into my domain and bully me just like you did in your suburban living room. The absolute gravity of my words hit them simultaneously. Brenda dropped her hands from her face, her fake tears drying instantly. Thomas froze completely solid, his aggressive posture crumbling into absolute paralyzing shock. The horrifying realization that they had just documented their own criminal complicity finally washed over them. Their faces drained of all color. They stared at the blinking red light on my desk. They were totally trapped in their own malicious, legally catastrophic web of lies. They handed me the perfect weapon to destroy their lives, and I smiled coldly. My parents remained completely frozen in absolute horror, staring blankly at the blinking red light of my recording device. They suddenly realized the sheer magnitude of their legal vulnerability. A slight movement caught my eye. Standing just outside the threshold in the executive reception area were Ashley and Devin. They had apparently refused to leave the building as instructed, choosing instead to cower behind my parents, hoping the family ambush would successfully reverse their terminations. I shifted my gaze away from my trembling parents and looked directly at my former brother-in-law. Devin was leaning heavily against the glass doorframe, looking absolutely devastated. The arrogant swagger of the chief financial officer was entirely erased. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. I stepped out from behind my glass desk, walked slowly across the expansive Persian rug, and stopped just a few feet away from the doorway. I folded my arms across my tailored jacket and looked Devin up and down with clinical disgust. I told you I wasn't just firing you, Devin. I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. He swallowed hard, clutching the door handle to keep his knees from buckling. He still clung to the desperate, pathetic hope that I would simply terminate his employment contract and allow him to walk away quietly into the corporate sector. He profoundly underestimated the absolute finality of my restructuring process. I did not just remove cancerous executives from my acquisitions. I entirely eradicated their ability to ever operate in the financial world again. I turned my attention to the heavy red binder still sitting perfectly aligned on my desk. I looked back at Devin, making sure he felt the full crushing weight of my next words. Exactly 1 hour ago, while you and my sister were crying in the downstairs lobby, my legal team officially submitted the unredacted forensic audit to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I revealed smoothly. I authorized the immediate release of every single piece of digital evidence we uncovered. They have the offshore routing numbers. They have the fraudulent tax filings. They have the exact timestamps of every unauthorized wire transfer you executed using investor capital. The federal authorities now possess a comprehensive, undeniable map of your entire embezzlement network. The stark reality of federal involvement hit the room like a physical shockwave. My parents turned around to look at Devin, their faces completely drained of color. They did not fully understand the complex financial terminology, but they absolutely understood the terrifying implication of the federal authorities being summoned. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to Devon, making sure he heard every single word perfectly. The feds are currently freezing your bank accounts, Devon. I continued delivering the information with terrifying calm. Every single dollar you siphoned into those Cayman Island shell companies is being locked down by federal warrants as we speak. Your domestic accounts are completely frozen. Your credit cards are heavily restricted. You cannot access a single cent of the money you stole to fund your fraudulent lifestyle. You are not going to a new job. You are not going to quietly resign and leverage your network. You are going to federal prison. You committed massive interstate wire fraud and aggressively defrauded institutional investors. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for the sheer magnitude of your financial crimes guarantee you will be locked in a federal penitentiary for at least 10 years. The final shred of Devon's manufactured reality shattered. His legs gave out entirely. He collapsed backward into a plush waiting chair located in the reception area, his broad shoulders slouching in absolute defeat. He buried his face in his shaking hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing groan that echoed miserably through the pristine corporate corridor. The custom-tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a pathetic costume on a completely broken man. He was no longer the arrogant, wealthy executive who mocked my discount clothes at suburban family dinners. He was a ruined, terrified criminal facing the absolute destruction of his freedom and his future. Ashley stood next to him, utterly paralyzed by the devastating revelation. For 36 years, she had lived entirely inside a perfectly crafted bubble of supreme entitlement. She had married a man she believed was a financial genius, a titan of industry who could provide her with an endless stream of luxury vacations, designer wardrobes, and elite social status. She had looked down on me my entire life, fully convinced that her opulent lifestyle was the ultimate proof of her undeniable superiority. Now the absolute truth of her existence was staring her right in the face. She finally realized that her husband's immense wealth was nothing but a criminal illusion. Her entire perfect life was heavily financed by stolen money. The expensive jewelry, the exotic trips, the massive suburban house, none of it actually belonged to them. It was all fraudulent, and it was all about to be violently seized by the federal government. Ashley turned her head slowly, looking down at her sobbing husband. The sheer horror on her face rapidly transformed into unhinged, explosive fury. She realized she was not just losing her job as a useless marketing executive, she was losing her entire identity. She screamed at him, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered hysteria. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, swinging her expensive handbag and hitting his shoulder violently. "You told me you were a genius. You told me you were making millions from brilliant offshore investments. You promised me we were rich. You stole that money. You ruined my life. You are going to jail and leaving me with absolutely nothing. How am I supposed to pay for anything? How am I supposed to maintain my life?" She was completely unraveling, screaming at the top of her lungs in my reception area. She only cared that her fountain of stolen wealth had dried up. Ashley shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently off the pristine marble walls of the reception area. Her hands formed tight fists as she struck Devon on the shoulder, demanding to know how he could possibly be so stupid. Devon did not try to defend himself. He just sat there, a broken shell of a man, staring blankly at the floor while his wife unleashed decades of spoiled entitlement directly onto his head. My parents watched this horrific spectacle unfold with absolute dread. The perfect suburban fantasy they had aggressively protected for 7 years was burning to the ground in front of their eyes. Brenda could no longer handle the collapse of her golden child. She snapped. She pushed past my father and rushed back into my office, her face pale and slick with panicked sweat. She grabbed the edge of my glass desk, her knuckles turning white as she leaned over the surface. Her fake tears from earlier were entirely replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. She abandoned the angry demands and the parental authority. She was practically hyperventilating, struggling to force the words out of her throat. "Samantha, you cannot let him go to jail!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking into absolute hysterics. "You have to stop the federal investigators right now. You have to cancel the audit and give him the money. You do not understand what is happening here. I stared at her, unfazed by her frantic outburst. I understand perfectly well that he committed federal wire fraud, I stated calmly. He stole millions of dollars from institutional investors to buy designer handbags and luxury yachts for your favorite daughter. The authorities are handling it now. It is entirely out of my control. No, you are not listening to me, Brenda wailed, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. We took out a second mortgage on the family home to loan Devin $500,000 to cover his massive margin calls last month. We gave him the equity we had left. If he goes down and the company bankrupts, he cannot pay us back. If he does not pay us back immediately, we lose the house. The executive suite suddenly went dead quiet. Ashley stopped screaming at Devin in the lobby. She turned slowly, staring at her mother in total shock. Even Devin looked up, his face twisted in horror. Thomas stepped forward, his face turning dark purple with absolute humiliation and rage. He grabbed Brenda by the arm, trying to physically pull her back away from my desk. "Shut your mouth, Brenda!" Thomas hissed through clenched teeth, desperately trying to silence his wife before she exposed their absolute financial ruin. "You do not tell her our private business. You do not tell her anything." But the damage was already done. The catastrophic secret was officially out in the open forever. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of their profound stupidity wash over me. My parents, the people who constantly mocked my discount clothes and my humble career beginnings, had literally mortgaged the roof over their heads to bail out a fraudulent startup executive. They had willingly handed over $500,000 of their own equity to a man who was actively embezzling money, completely blinded by their desperate need to maintain their wealthy social image. They gambled their entire livelihood on the golden child and lost absolutely everything. I did not laugh. I did not gloat. A strange clinical silence settled over my mind as my brain automatically processed the incredibly vital financial data Brenda had just practically handed to me on a silver platter. I stepped back from the edge of my desk. I turned my attention away from my frantic, terrified parents and looked directly at my high-resolution computer monitor. The glowing screen displayed multiple secure financial portals. I placed my hands on my keyboard and began to type with deliberate, calculated precision. I accessed our private equity firm's highly classified internal database, navigating straight to the distressed real estate and commercial debt acquisition portfolios. "Who holds the mortgage?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked firmly on the screen. "Which specific financial institution approved a $500,000 second mortgage for two retired adults based solely on a high-risk personal loan to a failing startup executive?" Thomas refused to answer. He stood rigidly, his jaw clenched, staring at me with pure hatred. He was drowning in his own catastrophic pride. But Brenda was completely unraveled. She was sobbing uncontrollably, utterly terrified of facing homelessness in her senior years. "Sterling Coastal Bank," Brenda blurted out, ignoring my father entirely. "We went through Sterling Coastal Bank. The loan officer was a friend from the country club. He pushed the paperwork through quickly because Devin promised a massive return on the investment within 30 days. He promised us we would make a fortune." I stopped typing. My fingers hovered perfectly still over the keys. I read the specific acquisition data displayed clearly on my private terminal. I looked at the exact dates, the transfer records, and the holding company authorizations. The universe possesses an incredibly ruthless sense of humor, and today it was delivering absolute poetry. I slowly raised my head and looked directly at my father. "You mortgaged the house through Sterling Coastal Bank?" I asked, ensuring my tone was perfectly even. Thomas swallowed hard. The remaining fight drained out of his posture. He nodded desperately, a pathetic, silent confirmation of his ultimate financial failure. I looked at the two people who had thrown me into the freezing rain 7 years ago. I smiled the coldest smile of the entire narrative. "My firm bought Sterling Coastal Bank's distressed debt portfolio exactly 2 weeks ago," I announced, letting the absolute horror of the words settle into their bones. "Devin cannot pay you back. You completely defaulted. which means I technically own your house, and I am ordering the bank to proceed with the foreclosure. The sheer weight of that statement crashed into the room, obliterating the last remaining fragments of their false reality. Complete and utter devastation finally took its permanent hold. Ashley, the untouchable golden child, who had spent her entire existence draped in unearned luxury, was now completely broke and entirely unemployable. Devin, the arrogant executive who had constantly mocked my hard work at every suburban dinner table, was staring down the barrel of a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate embezzlement and interstate wire fraud. And my parents, the deeply abusive architects of this entire toxic family dynamic, were officially losing the very home they had prized above their own daughter. They had literally handed the deed of their pristine suburban fortress directly to the exact same child they had so callously thrown out into the freezing rain 7 years ago. Thomas could not even form a coherent sentence. His mouth opened and closed silently, his face a terrifying shade of ashen gray. He clutched his chest, the reality of his severe financial ruin completely paralyzing his vocal cords. Brenda fell to her knees right there on my expensive Persian rug. She grabbed the edge of my mahogany desk, her fingers scrambling desperately against the smooth glass surface. She wailed a loud, agonizing sound that echoed harshly against the modern architecture of my executive suite. She begged me to show mercy, pleading with me to reverse the banking orders and stop the federal investigators. She promised she would make Ashley apologize. She swore they would finally treat me like a real daughter if I just gave them back their stolen capital and their heavily mortgaged house. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not blink and I did not break eye contact. I looked down at the woman begging on the floor and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of finality. I reached my right hand forward and firmly pressed the silver button on my intercom console. Security. I stated, my voice projecting crisp and unyielding authority. The unauthorized guests in my office are now trespassing on private corporate property. Please remove them from the executive floor immediately. Within seconds, the heavy mahogany doors swung wide open. 4 towering security guards entered the suite, their expressions perfectly neutral and highly professional. They moved with swift, coordinated precision. 2 guards approached Devin and Ashley in the reception area, gripping them firmly by the arms and guiding them aggressively toward the exit. Ashley screamed, digging the heels of her expensive designer shoes into the floorboards, completely ruining the leather as she desperately tried to fight the inevitable. Devin remained entirely limp, allowing the guards to drag his broken, terrified body down the hallway. The other 2 guards stepped into my office and grabbed my parents. Thomas tried to muster one last pathetic display of authority, shouting that he was my father and demanding respect. But the guard simply twisted his arms behind his back and forced him to walk. Brenda sobbed hysterically, reaching her hands out toward me as she was physically dragged backward across the room. She shrieked my name, crying out that I was destroying the family, crying that she would never forgive me for this absolute betrayal. I remained perfectly seated in my high-backed leather chair, entirely motionless. I watched the security personnel forcefully march my completely ruined family out of my office suite and down the long marble corridor. I did not turn away. I watched through the thick glass walls as they were shoved unceremoniously into the waiting executive elevator. Ashley was weeping uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running in dark streaks down her pale face. Devin was staring at his shaking hands, completely lost in his own federal nightmare. My father looked entirely defeated, staring blindly at the floor. My mother looked up and locked eyes with me one final time, just as the heavy metal doors began to slide shut. I held her panicked, desperate gaze until the elevator doors closed on them, forever sealing their catastrophic fate. The executive suite fell into a profound, immaculate silence. The toxic noise that had plagued my entire life was finally eradicated. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the sharp lines of my tailored charcoal suit. I walked slowly across the expansive room and stood quietly by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the breathtaking expanse of the magnificent Manhattan skyline. The bright afternoon sun reflected brilliantly off the surrounding steel and glass towers, highlighting the immense corporate empire I now commanded with absolute authority. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the crisp, conditioned air fill my lungs completely. I thought about the grueling 80-hour work weeks, the relentless financial audits, and the intense isolation I had endured to reach this exact pinnacle of power. I thought about the desperate, soaking wet girl who had run through the pouring rain with nothing but a cheap portfolio and a burning desire to survive. She possessed an absolutely unbreakable will that refused to accept defeat or surrender to their endless cruelty. That girl had built an indestructible fortress out of the bricks her family had thrown at her. Blood does not make a family, I realized, speaking the words softly into the quiet, empty room. It just makes you related by absolute genetic coincidence. They tried to bury me to elevate themselves. They did not realize they were just digging their own deep and massive graves. Have you ever had to use your success to silence the people who said you would be nothing? Drop your story in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. Remember, the best revenge isn't just living well, it's owning the ground they walk on. This marks the end of my journey, but the beautiful beginning of my absolute reign over the entire industry that gave me the power to conquer my demons and win forever. The story of Samantha brilliantly dismantles the deeply ingrained societal myth that we owe our biological families blind loyalty, regardless of how maliciously they treat us. The most profound and empowering lesson embedded within this narrative is that shared DNA does not equate to an unconditional license for emotional abuse, manipulation, or financial exploitation. For years, the protagonist was suffocated under the crushing weight of her parents' highly conditional love and her golden child sister's staggering entitlement. She was expected to sacrifice her own future, her literal ticket, out of crushing debt and poverty simply to maintain the superficial, fabricated image of her family's suburban perfection. However, her true liberation did not happen when she became a senior partner at a multi-million-dollar private equity firm, nor did it happen when she legally seized her parents' foreclosed mortgage. Her ultimate defining victory began the exact second she stepped over that heavy diaper bag, walked out into the freezing rain, and chose herself. This powerful narrative teaches us that our inherent worth is never determined by those who actively try to keep us small. When we deliberately detach ourselves from the toxic, exhausting cycle of seeking validation from our abusers, we reclaim total control of our own destiny. Samantha channeled her profound pain and rejection into an untouchable armor of corporate dominance and absolute self-reliance. She proved that you do not need to accept the diminished role assigned to you by a dysfunctional family system. True family is forged through mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine care, not through extortion and relentless control. Evaluate the relationships in your own life that constantly demand your sacrifice without ever offering respect, and have the courage to walk away to build your own empire today.